Good evening, and welcome to the final night of Listen, Learn, and Love, How to Disagree Well in a Polarized World from St. Mark's Episcopal Church in New Canaan, Connecticut. We are live this evening on both Zoom and Facebook Live. Delighted that the technology is cooperating better this week than last. Just a few words about how we'll move forward here for anybody who's new. We will have 30 minutes of lecture from our instructor, Dr. Jewelle Bickel, followed by 15 minutes or so of Q&A with Dr. Bickel. There are 3 different ways to participate in Q&A, 2 of which work over Zoom and 1 of which works over Facebook Live. On Zoom, you are welcome to present your questions in the chat function. That's all good. You can do so in 2 ways. You can do so either by presenting your question to everyone in the chat, or you can send me a private message. That is all good. Happy to do that. And if you send something to me as a private message, then I will ask your question anonymously and pose it anonymously. You may also raise your Zoom hand. You do that by going to the participants module in Zoom, and there's a button there to allow you to raise your hand. And if you do so, I'm happy for you to have a word here on video. If you're on Facebook Live, I am monitoring the comments, so happy for you to participate there. Our instructor tonight for this 4th night of Listen, Learn, and Love is again Dr. Jewelle Bickel. Dr. Bickel is a lecturer in the humanities at Mercy College and SUNY Westchester Community College. She's a graduate of the University of Oklahoma, where she did her PhD in philosophy and wrote her dissertation on how to disagree virtuously, hence tonight. Because of, well, actually, the press that we've sent out for tonight's session has promised a special election night edition of Listen, Learn, and Love. Dr. Bickel is going to be reflecting, in addition to what was regularly assigned for this particular day, discussion of self-trust and its importance to our navigation of disagreement. She's going to reflect on how we can apply everything we've learned in the class so far to election night and beyond. And the best way, I think, for Christians to dispose themselves to virtuous participation in election day and beyond is through prayer, by which we ask God to take up residence in us, to change us, even as we ask God to take up residence in and to change our world. So with that, I would like to begin, before I hand things off to Dr. J here, I'd like to begin with 2 prayers from the Episcopal or Anglican tradition from which St. Mark's is coming. A prayer for an election and a prayer for social justice and social reconciliation. Almighty God, to whom we must account for all our powers and privileges, grant the people of the United States in the election of officials and representatives may be guided in all wisdom, that by faithful administration and wise laws, the rights of all may be protected and our nation be enabled to fulfill your purposes. Grant, moreover, O God, that your holy and life-giving Spirit may so move every human heart, and especially the hearts of the people of the United States, that barriers which divide us may crumble, suspicions disappear, and hatreds cease, that our divisions being healed, we may live in justice and in peace. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. And with that, Dr. J.
Okay, there we go. Sorry, I always start my classes before I even unmute myself. Hello, everyone. Wonderful to see you. I can't believe this is our final meeting. I've really enjoyed our time together, like really enjoyed it. I hope you guys know that you just ask such wonderful questions, just really the best. And it's going to be helpful for me moving forward, not only with my research, but with my life. So thanks for being awesome. Before we do anything else, right, we're gonna check in real quick about the homework. And with this, I also wanna give a special shout out to Jennifer Delippi, who was pretty amazing, and she used some of our class suggestions on an op-ed for the New Canaanite about school start times. I noticed one comment in particular at the bottom said something along the lines of, that Jennifer had carefully laid out all the information in a clear way, both sides. And I feel like if that's not, open-mindedness, I don't know what is. So cheers to Jennifer for what you did. So last week, I asked you guys to practice open-mindedness. This included thinking about how acting with open-mindedness would differ from acting with tolerance. I see we have an awesome sort of first answer over here, that tolerance implies you're not really engaging, where open-mindedness involves engaging. I think that's a fabulous, fabulous sort of revelation about the two. I also asked you to think of a time when you were open-minded, how that might have helped you, what you did, how you could do it again, and to come up with, to see if you could come up with an argument for your interlocutor's position. Yes, people are saying it's hard. Good. Okay. So it's not just me. It's very hard to be open-minded, especially I find right in the middle of a disagreement. Sometimes reflecting on the merits of another point of view is one of those things that you do, when you're driving or taking a shower or something like that. It takes a little time and space to be able to think through the merits of another position. So I recommend that if you're having problems with it. Okay, today's the election. I'm sure that's like right on the forefront of everyone's mind. And it's a hotly contested, polarized election. And the division and the mistrust and all that stuff is not just national, it's local too. I love watching local politics. And so I've been looking at all the local news things. And I have to say, I was really disheartened to see some of the local rhetoric on social media related to just the races in New Canaan and Wilton and Greenwich and Norwalk. People saying things like, oh, this person is completely evil, or all people who think like this aren't worthy of living. That's a direct quote from one. And I just couldn't believe that, and I could believe, but it was just very hard to see this on both sides of the on both campaigns sides. These were not, of course, the individuals themselves. These were, for lack of a better word, minions online who were following them. So elections are difficult, and no matter what happens in the next few days, weeks, it's going to be challenging for all of us. So today we're going to talk about disagreements, and we're going to start with sort of what is so gut-wrenching about them. Why is it they're so hard for us? Then, of course, we'll introduce our intellectual virtues, and then we're going to focus on practical steps that you can take in the next couple of weeks, regardless of who wins, who loses, and how long it takes us to find out. Okay. Shall we dive in? So, have you ever said something along the lines of, how in the world can anybody believe that? Or, you must be living in a different world. You ever thought those things before? Those two sort of statements, although we say them usually in moments of exasperation and jokingly, they get right to the point of disagreement. So let's start with just an easy sort of example. Think about for a moment about someone who's as smart as you. They don't have to be geniuses, but that's for me, they're not geniuses, but like someone who's equally smart as you are, and someone who kind of knows your subject as well as you do, something like that. Or to call this person your peer for a moment. This could be colleagues at work, this could be a friend, it could be a spouse, it could be your child, whoever it is, your peer. Now, suppose you and your peer are in a restaurant eating, which this is, of course, either pre-COVID or post-COVID or in a fantasy world, whatever it is. So you're eating with your peer in a restaurant and you decide to split the tab. You both add tip, 20%, and taxes, and then you divide by 2. Now, you and your peer get different numbers. How do you react? You probably would both go to double check your math, right? You would either write it down this time or use a calculator on your phone, make sure there wasn't some place where you guys went wrong. For that split second, before you realize what happened, you doubt yourself. You think, do I know how to do math? And why wouldn't you? I mean, this person's your peer. They're as smart as you are, and surely they're as likely as you are to get something right. If you didn't doubt yourself for a second, you wouldn't be acting very rationally. Now, suppose you and your peer are in a disagreement about something else. I don't know, something that you can't just check on a calculator, like does God exist? Or should Connecticut regionalize its school systems, right? Something like that. Now, when you find out that your peer disagrees with you, you have that same moment of doubt. Am I right? It seems so obvious to me, but this smart person disagrees with me on this subject. Am I seeing things correctly? Self-doubt is the heart of disagreements. You see, we naturally trust our senses to get us to the truth. I'm sure we've probably all had times where we might have gotten something wrong. I think I see a spider out of the corner of my eye, or, I thought something was one color, but it was actually another color in the light, like that famous dress that was all over the news a few years ago. But even when we get things wrong, we still always go about trusting our senses, right? If I were to step outside and had a car coming at me, I wouldn't stop and be like, is this a car? Is my sight working correctly in this case? No, I just get out of the way. The same sort of thing happens with our reasoning and our faculty, right? So with only a few exceptions, we all kind of have the same sort of ability to reason, right? Biologically, evolutionarily, psychologically, I almost say psychotically, that'd be funny. Psychologically, we're similar, right? And so means we're equally able to process stuff, which means we're equally able to get things right or wrong. So for the most part, when someone tells you something, you trust their testimony. If one of you said it was raining outside, I would believe you. Why wouldn't I? That's the problem of disagreement. It attacks your self-trust. You go from thinking, how rational it is, to process things in the world. When someone disagrees with you, bam, how could they? What does this mean about me? What went wrong? Can I trust my own judgment? On the little things, it hurts a little less, but self-doubt that comes from getting math wrong is still self-doubt. It doesn't shake you to your core. But certain situations, like the ones we talked about last week, maybe other Christians who are reading the scriptures and interpreting it different ways than us, right? That hurts. That hits right at our self-trust. Because how can I trust my judgment on interpreting this if these other people who are equally smart as me are reading it and coming to very different conclusions? Self-doubt is the plague of disagreement, and it attaches to your beliefs. Sometimes it's just the minor ones, but sometimes it goes right at your fundamental beliefs. And that causes anxiety and fear and aggression and all the other sorts of lovely side effects that we see in the world right now, right? And people are scared, they're afraid. So what's the solution? I bet you all are like, surprise, intellectual virtues. Intellectual virtue is going to come in as sort of the hero on this, but why? Intellectual virtues, if used properly, are habits and patterns of thinking that aim us towards the truth. And if the problem is whether or not we can trust ourselves, then having patterns and habits that are truth-seeking can help allay that doubt, can help us feel better about what we're doing. Can I trust myself? Well, rather than having an existential crisis, I can see, did I make common mistakes, or did I look at everything? Was I being thorough in my thinking? I move on now. Sorry, I forgot to do this, but this is a fun sort of, how does self-trust affect you guys in your disagreement? So we focused on 3 intellectual virtues so far: humility, fortitude, open-mindedness. There are other intellectual virtues as well that can help with disagreement. Creativity would be especially helpful when you're doing problem solving in disagreements. Attentiveness to detail is really important also in disagreements, so you don't jump to conclusions. But the reason we're focusing on humility and virtue and open-mindedness is because they sort of help us to see ourselves and our peer, our interlocutor, to see it sort of more clearly, right? See sort of what we really believe and where it came from. So let's see what the virtues can do for self-doubt. And while we do that, we're going to think about a couple practical steps for the coming weeks. So the first week, we discussed intellectual humility, right? This is not just pretending that you don't, you know less than you know. Intellectual humility is about knowing your limits. How much do you actually know about a subject? How long have you got? How long ago did you get your information? I was thinking about this scenario recently, just that there's certain things I used to know a lot about, but I don't know anything about anymore, right? Solar system. I knew a lot about it when I was 10. Now I know nothing. And in that time, a lot has happened. Pluto wasn't a planet, was a planet. I don't even know what it is now. You guys can tell me in the people who know it better than I can tell us in the comments. But so whatever our information, thank you for who just did that. For whatever it is that we are sort of thinking about, we need to know sort of where's our information coming from, how well do we know it, and how recently have we thought about these things. But more than just sort of knowing our limits, intellectual humility is about acting in accordance with those limits, right? That's the hard part. I might be able to know that I don't know anything about the solar system, but I might still get offended when people correct me. That's sort of a problem for intellectual humility. That's something we're working on. However, having limits doesn't make you stupid. In most cases, being willing to accept your shortcomings is about as wise as you can get, right? I'm a philosopher, so Socrates is said to be the wisest man. And why was he the wisest man? Because he knew that he knew nothing. And now we can get into him another time. Acting with intellectual humility means you can trust yourself because you know you're not guesstimating something based on a little bit of evidence or a prior belief or something along that line. So as long as you are using intellectual humility, you can combat self-doubt in these cases. Now, what does this mean for our current political situation? Well, I have 3 suggestions for you on this one. And the first one I have to mention, even though I've mentioned it before, please avoid making broad sweeping claimants. Okay, I know it's all in the vogue. It's what everyone's going to do on the news tonight and tomorrow. But when you make these broad claims, you don't leave much room for limitation, right? You don't leave much room for knowing, for errors in those sorts of ways. And, intellectual humility is all about our limitations. So if you make some sort of broad claim, all this is that, whatever it is, you're not allowing for any sort of difference. You're not looking at any distinct thing in that way. Addition, have a willingness to be corrected. It's hard. It's hard, hurts a lot, especially recently, especially if it's about something that you care about. Being corrected is difficult, but it doesn't mean that you're dumb, right? Having the ability to learn from your errors, that gives you more reason to trust yourself in the future. That doesn't mean you need to doubt yourself. That means you can learn and trust yourself in the future. I also recommend being open to learning. I plan on learning a lot tonight. I don't know very much about the electoral system or different voting rights in different states. And so I plan on learning a lot about that tonight and probably in the next few weeks. So being open to learning, looking for more opportunities to figure out what is going on. Okay, intellectual fortitude. Intellectual fortitude is about the possibility that you're right and the goods that come from maintaining your belief when pressure's on. Fortitude shouldn't get confused with confrontation, though, right? Which is an intellectual more good sometimes, but that's for another day. We'll talk about that one. Self-awareness of your beliefs, particularly your fundamental beliefs, can cut the sting of self-trust. If you acknowledge, okay, this particular topic, it cuts right to something I care deeply about. And that can kind of help with the anxiety and the fear and the aggression that sometimes come from someone questioning a fundamental belief. We talked before in the last couple of weeks, right, about changing someone else's fundamental beliefs. And it is possible. But it also could happen for you, right? So fortitude involves holding onto your beliefs for just the right amount of time. This includes recognizing when you need to give them up. Your own fundamental beliefs might change occasionally in life, and it always feels world-shattering, right? This is because it's pulling our self-trust out from beneath us. but making yourself aware of what matters to you and why it matters to you can not necessarily prevent the anxiety and the grief and the fear, but maybe keep you from getting swept away in it. So here are my suggestions for the coming weeks. I encourage you to carefully think about your fundamental values, right? We've done this before, but I want you to think about them again and think specifically about sort of what political conversations relate to that and maybe push your buttons on those values. What sort of things are going to get you the most stressed, the most anxious, the most afraid? And have awareness of that so that if these conversations come about, you can recognize this is particularly meaningful to me, and that means I'm going to be very invested in this conversation, and I might need to, take a break, take a walk, and come back into it. The other thing I recommend is to think about shared civil values. Are there any values that we can share as Americans, that we can share with people with whom we disagree with? What are those values? And how do we sort of talk about those values and use those values to move forward? Open-mindedness is the ability to transcend your belief in order to take seriously somebody else's beliefs. Like the other virtues, right? It's truth-seeking. So open-mindedness doesn't mean you have to take up someone else's position. It just means you have to take seriously their position. Think about how this helps with self-trust, right? Part of the problem is you're worried, does this person get it right or did I get it right? It makes you doubt yourself. But if you use open-mindedness, then you're sort of able to avoid the existential crisis and instead go sort of straight to the what's going on here? What are the values going on? What's the evidence? What's the merits? Why do they feel this way about this position? That will all help with your self-trust. Now, here's my sort of challenge for you when it comes to open-mindedness in the next weeks. In pursuit of the truth, I challenge you to expose yourself to newspapers and news magazines whose editorial stance is opposite of your own personal political perspective, right? Ones that you could still trust, but are opposite of your own perspective. Commit yourself to reading that alongside your own preferred news outlets. You have nothing to lose, and the only thing you can gain is sort of possible further pursuit of truth, right? Either by changing your mind or confirming your already held belief, right? Fortitude in that case. I want to end briefly with just two examples of cases which I'm aware of where I feel like intellectual disagreement was done in a really virtuous way, and sort of leave them with you to see that this is possible, this is happening in the world. The first one's a local story. In 2018, Tom O'Day was running against Ross Tartell for the House District 125. This is here in Connecticut. O'Day won, and he is also running unopposed today, so I'm assuming he's going to win again today. Shortly after the election, I happened to be at a Grace Farms event where both O'Day and Tartell were at. And I had the sort of extra special opportunity to talk to them both about the election. Now, I can't, this is not their politics. I don't know anything about that. I just know about my conversation with them afterwards. I remember Tartell saying something along the lines of, we both agreed that we wanted to run because we want to help people. We just sort of disagreed on ways to get there. And we had different ideas about how to help, but we had sort of shared values, these shared things that we would commit to. It was a beautiful example of sort of intellectual fortitude. He still believed what he thought was sort of better in this situation, but they were able to, focus on the differences and engage in conversation rather than focusing on sort of the issues and the problems with the other person. And this enabled them to move forward. The two of them were very cordial with each other, very kind, and they respected each other in a way which is rare to find in politics. The final example I have for you is within our Anglican communion. So it's a high-ranking official in the Anglican communion who is a gay man. And I had an opportunity to speak with this man about the Anglican communion and its sort of issues with sexuality. And his grace and his compassion were outstanding. He didn't begrudge those who were against gay marriage. Rather, he kind of saw them as part of his family. You know, the whole church family were together, united. Moreover, he presented their positions in a really clear, precise, almost persuasive way. I was really impressed that he was able to take seriously these merits of these positions and understand where they were coming from. He said we needed to wait on each other. And it wasn't meant in like a snobbish way, like, oh, I'm so much better, I have to wait for these other people to catch up with me. No, it was not like that at all. It was like reflecting Jesus himself, I think, and sort of we wait with each other when we are sort of thinking about these issues. You know, Jesus himself, he spent most of his life with people who didn't agree with each other, let alone with him, right? He spoke with patience and he maintained his belief, although sometimes there was some snark. And he was about the entire community. And so that's my prayer for all of us moving forward in the coming weeks, that we can be more than just peacekeepers, right? We need bridge builders, you know, people who are able to recognize that virtuous disagreement doesn't have to involve this self-doubt, but instead we can seek the truth in love together.
Thank you so much for that, Jewelle. So I would invite everyone here to, you can, again, send us your questions here. You can put them in the chat. You can send them to everybody or just send them to me if you'd like for them to be anonymous. You can raise your Zoom hand under the participants module in Zoom, or if you're watching on Facebook Live, happy for you to add a comment there, and I'm monitoring those. While you guys are letting everything that Dr. J has said percolate a little bit, I have a question to get us started out. I'm interested, Jewelle, in the fact that changing our minds is not of a cultural value, at least not in America. I'm thinking about, you know, in our electoral context, on both the left and the right, different candidates have gotten attacked for changing their minds in the course of their career. But what you've said about intellectual humility and open-mindedness both seem to suggest that we wouldn't always change our mind when we take seriously the position of another, but that we should be prepared, perhaps, to change our minds when presented with new information, because you told us to like love learning, to be open to learning new things, to be open to new information, and so on. So I don't need to, I'm not asking you so much to give us a diagnosis of our culture, like, why do we hate changing our minds so much as Americans? Why don't we value it? Why don't we think, oh yeah, that's actually a great example. Somebody who learned something in the history of, like, you know, the years they were serving in office, or the years they were a priest, to take a church political example. But instead, how do you, this is my question for you. It's not why we're that way, but what could we do to better model virtuous mind changing for each other, and maybe especially for the next generation? I'm really concerned about this because I'll just say on Thursday night, those of you from St. Mark's know that I have a Zoom check-in with our teenagers. And you know what our teenagers wanted to talk about? The election, because they're watching and they're concerned. And I'm concerned to model these intellectual virtues that Jewelle's talking about better perhaps than we have in the past, and better perhaps than I have in the past. So how can we better model virtuous mind changing?
Thanks, Justin. That's a really good question. How to model virtuous mind changing. I think that there's a couple different ways we can do this. One is sort of acting with intellectual humility. This is knowing your limits and being able to admit, I did not know a lot about that subject, and I believed this, but now, having learned this, having spoken with experts or read experts, I've come to this new place. I think that we worry about mind changing because we think it means that you're weak-willed in some way. And I think that instead of thinking about it that way, we need to think, focus on the things that are good about mind changing, that you will listen to people, that you will be there for them. And so in that way, I think that's kind of how we can model this for our next generation, right? Is when we're corrected, gladly, accept it and say, oh, okay, thank you. I didn't know that. It's always easier said than done. But I think that's one good way we can start modeling this.
Thanks, Jewelle. Really appreciate that. And appreciate too, Jennifer DeLippi there in the chat pointing out that so are the younger ones, not just the teenagers are watching. Interesting. Do you want to say a word here, Jewelle, while other people are queuing up their examples about the role that exemplars and people we admire play in your thinking about virtuous disagreement? So you've just given us two stories of two people, or three people, I suppose, who you admire in this regard. And they are what you would call philosophically exemplars. Do you want to say a bit more about that and how they can be useful, maybe particularly for kids?
Absolutely, absolutely. So the thing with exemplars is, right, they're really good at whatever it is they're doing. And so when we're looking at exemplars of disagreement, we're looking at people who it's not that they win all the time, it's that they are able to sort of practice these virtues in a way. And watching them and learning what they do is really a big step in sort of moving forward, right? We've talked before about how do you know when I should be, humble? How do I know when I need to hold on to my beliefs and all these things? And sometimes sort of seeing others and seeing how they've handled situations, others that you admire, can be sort of a step in the direction of, okay, this sort of gives me insight. I know that that's been helpful for me. These individuals that I mentioned have helped me think about in situations where I really disagree with someone. How would have they handled this, or would they handle this, and how can I handle it in a similar way?
Thanks so much. Just full disclosure here. So I'm kind of acting like I'm a neutral arbitrator of this conversation, but those of you all from St. Mark's know that I'm married to Jewelle. Just to say, I'm way inspired by these people too, particularly by the last. This person's been a great example for me in the church with all the, anyway, with all of the, I just did a funeral for a deacon in the Episcopal Church who said, it told me before that she died, she didn't want to become a priest because of too much politics. Really, really funny. So anyway, this person's been an example for me too. Please do send in your questions here in the chat. If you have a particularly difficult question, bring it on. We've got Jewelle here in the hot seat for 10 more minutes. So anything you've been dying to ask her, please do send it. And if you think it's a little too dicey, you can always send it to me, and I'll try to soften the blow a little bit. Jewelle, do you want to say a word about the difference between peacekeeping and bridge building? I really love that. I know I'm biased because I love you, but I really love that. I'm ready to make it a meme or start a Twitter hashtag. You want to say a bit more about peacekeeping versus bridge building?
Yes. So peacekeeping is, it goes along with tolerance a lot, right? I love peacekeeping. Peacekeeping is my happy place, right? Everyone, it's okay, calm down. We don't have to be upset. Bring it down a notch. I live for those moments. Not that just because that's kind of what I care about. Bridge building involves actually speaking to people who you disagree with, not just sort of suppressing the conversation, which happens sometimes with, when you tolerate a belief, but having that conversation, having, you think this, I think this, can we move forward? Do we have common values? And I think that for our country, that's going to be really important, not just nationally, but locally. I mentioned those sort of Facebook posts that I saw. And I think that for us locally, we need to think about sort of what are our values and how can we as a community reach out to people who we disagree with and have the real conversations, but still look forward.
It's really beautiful. I would like to think that there are at least 32 people plus a couple on Facebook Live here who are already doing that amongst each other. So have a comment here sent to me, noting that there's a lot of fear, especially or including among our kids these days, who are hearing crazy rumors about what might occur after the election. And I know we're all sitting on pins and needles a little bit, wondering what's going to happen this evening or tomorrow, or et cetera, et cetera. And I wonder, knowing that you and I are Monday morning quarterbacking a little bit, any advice that we'd have to give about raising children, because we don't have children, but you are a teacher. And how would you recommend, do you have an idea for parents for thinking about how to talk to their kids about what's going on right now, and especially about rumors that they might be hearing about unrest and our future?
So noting my severe limitations on this, I have some thoughts as a teacher. So I have students who've mentioned this to me even this week, that they just are very nervous about the future and what it means and all that they've heard. I think there's a couple ways we can do this. As a Christian, my first instinct is to say, pray. Prayer, bring it to God. And alongside of that, do not try to control the things you can't control. So I was watching the news last night, and they had some sort of, do you have election fatigue? Here's what you should do. And that was one of the sort of suggestions they gave, was to recognize that there's certain things that are going to be out of control, and trying to control them is going to bring more anxiety and more fear. And so in that way, sort of admitting, the serenity prayer, Lord, help me to know what I, need, what I can change, and the wisdom to know the difference between what I can change and what I can't, in that way.
Thanks, Jewelle. I have another comment here just sent to me. I was asking about intergenerational disagreement and the particular kinds of challenges it presents, suggesting that younger people might find older members of their family to be leaning maybe a little bit too much into the intellectual fortitude. Perhaps, this is the way that they've thought, the experiences that they've had, the information that they've received for a very long time has now become closed-minded to new perspectives. And I think that similarly, older people in families might find younger folks in their families to be outrageously provocative / don't have enough experience / don't know the way the world is actually working, and so on. How do you suggest families go about those intergenerational disagreements in a constructive way?
That's a really excellent question. I think I encourage open-mindedness and humility for both sides. So practically speaking, what does that look like? I think that sort of for the older members of the family, they have the experience, they have some wisdom and knowledge, which younger generations do not necessarily have. And so you need to just admit, you need to be willing to sort of admit your limitations in this case, right? When I was 15, I thought all sorts of things that I now know, I know are different. And I hope that next, when I'm 15 years from now or 30 years from now, I sort of can look back on things that I know and realize I didn't know them in the way I thought. I think also sort of on the other side, sort of as trying to understand the younger generations is going to require open-mindedness, and maybe, if they are being provocative or something like that, trying to see, is there a merit, trying to get down to the values and what is at stake in these conversations.
Thank you. I want to turn here to Reverend Elizabeth's question, which is, do you have advice on how to open conversations with people in your life who might be heels dug in to engage them? I mean, that could be an intergenerational debate, or it could be some other thing. Sometimes people with opposing views don't want to talk about it, just don't. In that case, should you be proactive in talking to the other side? I mean, I know we've talked a lot about, there are scenarios in which you have two people who are trying to seek the truth and to disagree, trying to do so well. And then you have circumstances where somebody's not playing the game that way. They're not trying to do this well, but you are. And there are different kinds of advice you give in both cases. What do you do with an example of somebody who's dug in and doesn't even really want to talk about it?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So I mentioned earlier in stuff that sometimes confrontation is a virtuous thing to do. I think that you really need to be sort of prudent about which situations you use that for. In particular, for situations where you or your most fundamental values feel like they're being, threatened or squashed in some sort of way. Those might be the situations for confrontations. For people who have really dug in their heels and they don't want to talk about it, it's challenging, right? You can't make them talk about it. The only thing I could really suggest is start by asking them questions about their own beliefs. They dug in their heels. They don't want to listen to your side. Okay, fine. But can you get them to talk a little bit about why they think what they think? Can you get them started in that way? And that way, maybe even possibly open up the conversation.
Thank you very much. Want to name the fact that Stephanie Johnson and Jennifer DeLivia are having a great conversation in the chat, sharing some ideas here, particularly about encouraging kids to share their own concerns and their anxiety. That shared stress is different than stress which is not completely shared. I think you and I have both seen in our students that one of the things that has made our cultural moment more difficult for college students anyway, and for graduate students at the beginning of their careers that don't have direct experience working with kids, myself or you, is our isolation. So the stress is not shared, actually. Do you have any advice about how we can share our disagreements, stress, whether with kids or with adults? How do you recommend you do that? Maybe with a pint of Ben & Jerry's ice cream?
I think that's good. I think that reaching out is probably a really good start. Sometimes when we're feeling the most stressed, the most anxious, we kind of close in on ourselves and we forget about our community. We forget about those who we care about, those with whom we can commiserate or whatever it needs to be. And so that would be my recommendation, is to reach out. With my students, I always suggest, is there someone in your life that you can talk to about these things? Have you, talked to anyone who's like a counselor about these things? I'll listen to them, but, I can't fix anything. I'm just a sounding board in that way. But reaching out to various people could be a really a way to start, especially in a place right now where, you can't just show up at the door with ice cream. I mean, you could, but they probably won't let you in.
Thanks for that. I won't let anybody in if they have ice cream because of COVID, but before COVID, anybody could come in if they had ice cream. So Jennifer Walsh here is saying, I do not consider myself a good debater, so often wimp out of intellectual debate, especially when I care a lot about the topic. I'll say, Jennifer, we could put this in the third person here. What if one considers oneself not a good debater? Because I had that moment too, except I have the opposite reaction, which is I don't whip out. I go guns blazing into the debate, which is just interesting because it has to do with self-trust here, I think, Jewelle. So what do you do? How do you suggest we build good self-trust so that we can participate virtuously in disagreements and not be like me, where when I get really upset, I get upset and I go way emotional. And maybe when Jennifer doesn't consider herself a good debater, has that crisis of self-trust, she withdraws from the debate. How do you suggest both sides? Jennifer, I don't have the facts the facts in the brain. I don't know about that. No, I think that's a really good question. And Jennifer, I'm with you. When debates get sort of pressured, especially about things I care about, I'm like, I gotta go. Like that's my natural inclination, is like, you can be right tonight, whatever.
So one of the things that's helped me, and one of the things that I hope would be helpful, is to practice disagreeing with people whom you trust, people who respect you, and people who make you and your opinion feel valued. That is a good place to start. Disagreeing with strangers or teachers or whoever it is in your life, that can be kind of scary, and you don't necessarily know that you're in a safe place to do that with them. But disagreeing with people who care about you and who respect you and your intellect is a good way to start, because you can try out ideas. You can say things and then say, I don't know, I need to think about that, or something like that. And so that's a way to kind of ease into it, is practicing it, and practicing it with people who are going to build up your self-trust in that way.
So your comment about safety, Jewelle, reminds me of a question that I have, which is, what kind of relationship do you think we need to cultivate in order to disagree well? Like, we need to have a relationship ahead of time, and then we can disagree well or safely, or maybe we can practice it more boldly than if we're disagreeing with a stranger, which you also want us to be able to do well, but which is harder. I mean, I'm thinking about recently, you and I had an experience where it was very hard actually to pipe up and disagree with somebody who we didn't know. We actually just got one little word out and said, actually, I feel about it a little differently than that. And that was it, just one sentence. And that was it. Then we both backpedaled. And that's even with me. And I tend to be, I love arguing. So do you have a word about relationships and safety versus that kind of thing?
So there's a lot of talk about safe spaces, for students and things like that. I think that when we're having these disagreements, safety means something different. Safety means other people who are also seeking the truth in that way. In my class, I tell my students, look, this class is not going to harm you, but it is going to challenge you, and it's going to challenge your beliefs. And ideally, that's what happens when you're in a disagreement with someone, is that you will be challenged in some sort of way. And so it won't be safe, but it will be sort of a place where you are both working together. You're both trying to get to the truth. It's not sort of who can beat the other person. And I think that's kind of how it goes with certain situations, is that, again, if the other person is really just not interested in the truth, it makes it very hard to continue to try to work with them, and makes you want to give up really easy in that sort of way.
It makes me think that we need to get onto Facebook and say, I'm looking for friends who are pursuing the truth, and we would probably end up with 3 or 4 friends, because who wants to? Yeah, great, cool, glad. Really want to go out to dinner with the person who's pursuing truth.
Yeah, any of you guys are interested, let us know. It'll be great.
Yeah. No, actually, really, really beautiful. I want to come to Father Peter's question here last. But before that, I want to say that somebody's written me privately in the chat with an example of more ways to handle intergenerational disagreements. So she was recently having a disagreement with a family member, with a niece, and it became very, very heated. And so she asked her nephew, who was kind of aged in between her and the niece, to enter into the conversation, and it diffused the generational gap in the conversation. They ended up having a really beautiful and meaningful discussion, which I think is awesome. I never would have thought of that, because I don't study this stuff for a living, but incredible advice, I think.
Yeah, that's pretty fantastic. That's a really good suggestion, right? Sometimes you need to add more players to the conversation so that it's not just certain views and certain voices being heard.
So last question here from Peter. What are your thoughts, Jewelle, about the aftermath of the election and a sense of national healing, no matter who wins?
Yes, I think those are really good questions. And I hope and pray that as a nation, we can begin to heal. I think that it's going to take these bridge building that I talked about earlier. It's going to take being willing to talk with people who you maybe disagree with. And it's going to take patience. Sometimes I think we're like, let's do it ready to go, you know, but, you know, we need to wait on each other. And that doesn't necessarily mean that like we're going to end up winning and they're wrong, but we're going to, you know, be with each other as we work through all these issues.
Thank you. Thank you so much. As we conclude here with the, I'd like to conclude by praying the prayer attributed to Saint Francis.
Mm-hmm.
And want also to name, there are worlds of thanks going on in the chat here. Some thanks for Jewelle, some thanks for others who have participated in the conversation. With Reverend Elizabeth asking Pilate's question, what is truth? Yes. Excellent. Jenny has asked, seeking the truth is complex, and yes, absolutely. But anyway, lots going on in the chat, and just to say, we're incredibly grateful to each of you for giving up so much of your time during the week.
Thank you.
These last 4 weeks, a beautiful thing to be with you and talking about these things. And a word of thanks here, you know, in my associate rector cap, not in the husband cap, to Dr. J for your time and expertise with us. Anyway, it's been a blessing to me. I won't say in which disagreements I have learned more about myself, but I will just say I have learned more about my disagreements in my life from taking this class. So anyway, thank you for that, Jewelle. And I want to end here with a prayer attributed to St. Francis, because I think it embodies this bridge building to which Jewelle is saying we are called by God in this moment. So the Lord be with you. Let us pray. Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Where there is hatred, let us sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is discord, union. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. Grant that we may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved and to love, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen. As we say at St. Mark's, with a short little addendum that you may continue the conversation with Dr. J by sending an email to me, and I can forward it on to Dr. J. And more offerings in this particular vein may be forthcoming in the next year. If you would be interested in being a part of a continuing conversation around these sorts of issues, please do let us know. We're going to go on a break here in any case, but future offerings are certainly possible if there's interest. Again, if you want to follow up with Dr. J here immediately, just shoot an email to me. You can find my information at stmarksnewcanaan.org, or if you're registered for this class, I will send out the recording and Jewelle's advice about how to move through the days after the election in an email sometime tonight. As we say at St. Mark's, go and make disciples who live a deeper life in Christ, a more holy communion with one another, and a greater love for the world. With thanksgiving to God for you, Dr. J, and for this group. And
Thank you all so much. I've really, really enjoyed my conversation with you. You guys are amazing.